So, Kev, it's time to move on to this week in trading history. And so I put together a fun little piece that I think will make the hard money gold guys kind of happy. Well, we're going to circle back to a little bit of history for the Lincoln Greenback. And
Nice.
so this week in trading history, we had it was in June of 1864 where the U.S. Treasury stopped issuing these greenbacks. And but let's talk about these greenbacks. It was actually on July 17th of 61, 3 years earlier, that they were issued to help finance the Civil War, which was the
Wow.
first non-interest bearing note created by the U.S. government. So let's kind of go back in history. I mean, those people that have taken the time to read the Constitution, the
Yeah.
hard money guys always reference it where,
Well,
gold and silver are the only viable money, a legal tender in the United States
right.
based on
Like
that
the hard money
Constitution.
guys, this was the beginning of the end.
Yes. And
It
so
was like
it
it was
was.
fiat currency. It was like that's the end.
That is the end. And so prior to this event, gold and silver were coins were the only legal tender in the United States. And what ended up happening, there were paper notes, but they were in the form of bank notes that were privately issued by banks. And so now they were individual bank notes. So whatever bank you were banking at, they had actual bank notes from that bank. Think of it like a check, but like a bearer bond check where it's just cash, right? But it's only
Right.
cashable at that bank. But there were thousands and thousands of banks because they all kind of got purged in the 1930s when majority of them went bankrupt during the Great Depression
Yeah,
and
but just
everything
think about the
consolidated.
beauty of perfect competition there, Patrick.
Yeah.
It's like a
Anyway,
libertarian's dream.
oh, absolutely. And so the point is that back then these banknotes existed, and that was used back then. But gold and silver were the only real legal tender, right?
Right.
And so if you had these banknotes, they failed and they became worthless. So now, when President Abraham Lincoln assumed office, he obviously understood the importance of money toward the war effort, and that's when he appointed Salmon Chase as the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. And like everyone at the time, everyone underestimated, like almost they do every single time, the duration and the cost of a war. Like that's
Right.
the one thing through all history. Everyone always thinks that it'll be shorter and cheaper and then it always becomes much longer and more expensive. And so within months, it became clear that the cost of the war would run far beyond the government's limited income from tariffs and because they didn't have income taxes going on back then. And so the revenues that the government was making, it wasn't sufficient to be able to fund this war. Now, what was crazy, and this would make you so happy hearing these kind of numbers, but when Lincoln went to sought major loans from banks to fund the war, the
Yeah.
banks were offering interest rates in the 24 to 36%.
They obviously knew how to judge the credit of the American government.
Exactly, like 24 to 36% interest rates, and so obviously such terms would basically have bankrupted the United States. It just was not a solution. And what's interesting was how the Confederates down south actually dealt with it. They actually created what was a cotton back dollar, and many of both sides in the war went to London for a lot of financing to guess who?
Oh, with his beady little eyes.
Yes, yes. They went to the Rothschilds, which played a role in funding the
Oh,
Civil
I
War
I thought you
on
were going
both
to say
sides.
Colonel Sanders.
Well, yeah, no, Colonel Sanders went to the Rothschilds, but nonetheless, there was one of the different ways of financing the war. But so ultimately, so let's go back to the business. So it was in July of that 1961 that the Congress authorized $50 million of these demand notes that bore no interest. that were redeemable on demand. Now, what's interesting is that when they started issuing these notes, they actually were redeemable in gold. But they were not legal tender before a year later. It was like in March of 1962 that they became legal tender. But initially, when they were issued, they were actually still backed by gold, and they were what's called not legal tender at the time. But then what happened was that as they moved on, actually that's where they got their name. So they were printed, and the reverse side of this note was printed completely in green ink. So they called them the greenbacks. Right. And so while they were initially discounted relative to gold, fully being redeemable, it was later that year after they issued them that they suspended the redemptions of them into gold, and they started to decline, and they started paying interest on them and doing all sorts of little things but they basically started the printing money. It became a fiat currency. They started printing the cash and to fund the Civil War, and ultimately it did stop in This Week in Trading History back in 1864. So they only issued it during the war. And eventually, all of the greenbacks, like 95% of them, were collapsed. So because they became tender to pay duties and other types of tariffs, and so they basically eventually were all collapsed back into the government as it came along. But what was really interesting here was this idea of a government issuing money this way, or these kind of notes, is that those that think that this is history, well, you can actually watch history being made real time in Italy right now.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's the mini bots. And those not familiar with what's happening in Italy is that the anti-establishment coalition that is running Italy right now is looking for solutions to circumvent the ECB and Brussels and everything like this. And so they're talking about issuing short-term treasury bills that would be these non-interest bearing treasuries that would be called these Italian mini bots, and these securities would be able to be used as receipts to pay taxes, to buy goods and services, and they could even buy petrol at the state-owned oil company in Italy. And so they're talking about basically creating almost like a parallel currency, and they would be able to print these mini bots and actually it would be the equivalent of something very similar to what happened with the Lincoln Greenback. And so watching what happens in Italy and whether they do this and how it plays out is actually the modern day version of the Lincoln Greenback.
Patrick, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I hope they do it, man. I hope no, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, you and your fiscal spending stimulus rant. Why don't you please let our listeners once again hear it?
No, I won't. I won't. I won't go once again. We can maybe cut our way to prosperity like you want to, but we'll just leave it at that. But that's a fascinating story. Thanks for sharing that with us today, Patrick.